Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Sheker Chan b'Mesach Tav B'Tzivanu Lasuk B'Divrei Torah. Barif Adonai Eloheinu Divrei Toratcha b'Finu P'Yavcha Beit Yisrael v'niyeh Anachnu v'Tzeitzeinu v'Tzeitzeim P'Cha Beit Yisrael Kulanu Yodei Shemecha v'Lemdei Toratecha Lishma Baruch atah Adonai L'mei Torah L'Amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato Baruch atah Adonai Noteinu Torah.
Amen.
Okay. Kev, read this time.
Okay. 7, number 7, page 16. Okay. You should not hate your brother in your heart. If you act in a friendly manner towards someone in his presence, but speak against him behind his back, you violate this prohibition. This prohibition refers only to concealed hatred. When you openly tell someone about your dislike for him, you do not transgress this prohibition, but are guilty of not fulfilling the mitzvah of loving a fellow Jew. Okay, next one. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. Vayikra. This is in Vayikra chapter 19. If you are angry at someone because he refused to grant you some favor, and in revenge you speak Lashon Hora about him, you have violated those two prohibitions. In addition to having spoken Lashon Hora, for recalling that person's refusal to render you assistance, you are guilty of bearing a grudge. For slandering him, you are guilty of taking vengeance. You are obligated to forget the entire incident. Next one.
No, I think that's enough.
It's.
You know what? Each of those concepts are like very detailed, and it takes a while to contemplate on it. We can either do quantity or contemplate on each of those concepts. It's sometimes better for somebody to your face to tell you something than to be duplicitous behind your back. It's far less dangerous. At least you know where you stand with that person, I think. All right. Let's just go straight into it. So, all right. So we've gone through everything else. The only thing we want to know is we want to know who authored this particular brisa. So we're on 25a3, and whom is the Tana about whom you learn that he says that the semen of a zav conveys tumah through carrying, and would thus be the Tana of the brisa, which rules similarly. In other words, who wrote the brisa and who's involved with this particular Gemara? The statement is, it is not Rav Eliezer and not Rav Yehoshua. But was taught in a brisa, the semen of a zav contains tumah through touching, but it does not convey tumah through carrying. These are the words of Rav Eliezer, so it's clear that he doesn't hold that the semen of a zav affects both by touching and carrying, only by touching. But Rav Yeshua says it conveys tumah even through carrying. So we want to know, how come he can't be the author of the brisa, since he says it does convey tumah through carrying? But once you understand his reason, you'll understand. Because it's impossible that zav semen shall be without traces of zav fluid.
Yeah.
Implying that if it wasn't for this reason, the zav semen would not in and of itself convey tumah through carrying. Okay. And since that particular case is that if you're able to separate it, it's not intrinsically within the semen, it's not a problem, and it doesn't carry through to carrying. It's only because it's embedded within the zav fluid itself. Fine. The Gemara now shows which Tanaic view is embodied in this brisa. Rather, it is the following Tana whose view is reflected in the brisa, for we have learnt in the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah, it's the first 3 Mishnahs of Kalim, and this is how it works. We learned this in the beginning of Bava Kamma, in the first daf. There are 3 avos hatuma, primary sources of tumah, that transmit tumah only through touching. So we learned, what were they? Sheret, in other words, is one of the 8 dead creatures, mouse, lizard, etc.,
Yeah.
etc., they ate, semen of a human male, and one who has contracted tumor from a human corpse. So anything that these avosa tumors touch gets infected. The Mishnah cites here that there is a level above that, greater than 3 avosa tumor that transmit tumor, and they not only transmit tumor through touching, but also through carrying as well. That's according to Rashi. And this is what we're talking about. And for we learned in the Mishnah, above them are the zav fluid of a zav, his spittle, his semen and his urine, and the menstrual blood of a nida, which convey tumor both through touching and through carrying. Thus we see that the Tana of this Mishnah holds that the zav semen conveys tumor both through touching and through carrying. So the Gemara obviously questions this proof, but it's saying maybe perhaps here too, the zav semen conveys tumor even through carrying, because it's impossible that such semen shall be without traces of zav fluid. So then how do we know that this tumor capacity to the zav semen carries through to the carrying as well as the touching part within its own capacity? So the Gemara answers, it's actually the order in which it was stated. If it was so that it means that the zav semen conveys tumor through carrying only, because it necessarily contains traces of zav fluid, let him state the zav semen alongside his zav fluid. Why does he state it alongside his spittle? It must be because it's derived from his spittle. Thus, the Gemara successfully identified the tunnel of this price in 25a with the tunnel of this particular Mishnah.
Damon?
Yeah?
Is it distinguishing between touching and carrying, or is it carrying the same thing as touching?
No, it's not the same thing as touching at all. In other words, if you see the order in which it mentions it, the order is significant. So if it, for example, after the word the zav fluid of a zav, mentioned the word semen, in that particular order, it's associating with semen next to zav fluid, meaning that zav fluid is intrinsic in the semen, and therefore that is the reason that it conveys tumor both through touching and carrying. But the fact that it's the word his semen comes after the word his spittle, means that even if the zav fluid wasn't part of his semen intrinsically is highly infectious and affects not only through touching, but through carrying, just like his spittle. What does it mean? It said that a zav spittle affects anybody that happens to be spat on, or he spits when he talks and he spits on an object they're carrying. So any sort of tumor that infects through both touching and carrying is obviously more severe. So in Kalim deals with vessels in the first to third Mishnah. It states that if it affects Kalim by both touching and carrying, that the person that lifted up the Kalim, the vessels are infected, it's obviously more severe. So the less severe, even though it is severe, with the avosa tumor, semen, sherets, and touching of a human corpse. But the zav fluid of a zav, the spittle, the semen, and the urine, and the menstrual blood of a nida convey tumor both through touching and through carrying. So it's a higher level of tumor. Obviously, what's the highest level of tumor, Gab? What do you think the highest level of tumor is?
A corpse.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I also just said it. Yeah.
But I just want to ask you a question, Damon. Sorry, before you continue, can you just, you kind of gave us an example, but I need a better example. Can you just give us an example of touching and carrying? Because how does it work? So you're a Zava, give me an example of that Zava touching and an example of that Zava carrying, because I don't really get that.
Okay, so the best way to do it is take a pure person who's a tahor person who is pure other than his semen. So if his semen lands on his wife, for whatever reason, they're having normal marital relations, then in that case, she is infected and impure and has to wash that off, and she's impure until nightfall, and then she'd have to go in the mikveh, etc. So that would be through touching her directly. His semen.
But that's the semen touching. If he touches her, it's fine. That's not going to make her impure. It's just purely the semen has to direct contact. Is that correct?
In the case of a towel person, yeah.
Okay.
Unless he touched the semen, at which case it would transfer from his hand to her tummy or whatever the case may be. But if there was no semen, it would have to directly touch her unless it was on his person.
So if it lands on his hand, is his whole body contaminated or just his hand?
You know what? The actual truth of it is I'm not 100% sure. The laws of Tumantara have got a whole section on its own. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay. It's fine. And the other question is, just give me an example of carrying. So now, how does carrying work?
Okay, I'll answer your question now with pleasure. So with a zav, his spittle is so infectious that even if his spit lands on not only the person themselves, if his spit lands on somebody, for sure it's touching them. But even if the spit lands on a book, on a sefer, for example, and the person picks up that book, that can contract. The only way it can't contract is if you take a stone and throw it at an object to move it. So there's no contact between you and the infected object.
Okay, so you're saying that, okay, so it passes, the tumor passes through to the stone, he then throws the stone, and that stone is being carried, basically.
No. What I'm saying is the only way to move it, we learned this before with the case of Choros. We learned in the case of a Choros with the Zav. So with Choros with the Zav, if I pick up an object and I throw it, the minute it's left my hand and it knocks another object off the shelf, it's not a long enough sticking contact to contract the tumor by transfer.
Okay.
But the minute I take a book and I've got spittle, and I spit on the book, and you've picked up the book, and it's not that I've spat on your hands, and I would be a zav, in that case, the book is infected. So it's not like I almost have to use my spittle on you directly. If I do a spittle on your object and you pick up the object and you're carrying it, you get infected.
Okay. So what you're saying there, James, is if you throw something that's contaminated and hits object and it's not a long enough time, and knock something, that doesn't become contaminated. It's only if it's an object that you actually physically pick up and hold that's being contaminated by.
Or your spit directly.
Yeah, no, let's say it's on the book, like you said.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can think of it like COVID, actually.
Okay.
It's exactly like COVID. If a person's got COVID and they spit on a stone and they throw it and knock something off the shelf, and that thing lands off the shelf, it's unlikely that there's enough transfer contact time to allow any sort of infection.
But can a stone makabel tumor? Certain materials can't, though.
So certain materials can and certain materials can't. Certain are more susceptible. Just like, where do we see this? If you see in the transfer of heat, you have what you call conductors of electricity and heat, where some objects are more susceptible than others. So we're going to learn about that now.
Okay. The question I wanted to ask you earlier, you said the semen lands on the woman, she becomes tumor. But I'm assuming if it lands in the woman, it's fine.
It's fine, yeah.
Okay,
that's the
just checking.
Game. The name of the game is to aim.
So basically, do not waste. If you waste, you become tumor.
Yeah. Why can't we just have one clean shear?
I asked a legitimate question there. I mean, people are going to say, well,
You must edit this, Arthur.
Because of the way you say, you sound like that semen is always tumor, but it's not. If it's in the right place, it's not, and if it's in the wrong place, it is. Basically, that's what it is.
Yeah. All right. So we've now identified the who runs the bride. How does this work? Now the Gemara has the returning of a question. It says, okay, so we've worked out before about the principle of the dayu, but it's saying, is there any Tana that might actually totally reject the concept of the dayu? Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, but there is this following Tana who does not seem to hold and subscribe to the principle of dayu. It is sufficient, even when the kol v'chomer is not nullified by applying that principle. Because what we learned is, like, for example, Rabbi Talfon doesn't subscribe to the Dayu when the Kol V'chomer will be nullified completely. If it restrains it, he will. So it's making that as the caveat, meaning that in this case, the Kol V'chomer is not nullified by applying the principle. And it seems that this particular Tana that we're going to deal with now doesn't apply to the principle of Dayu, it is sufficient at all. For it was taught in a Bryson, from where is it known to us that a mat contracts tumah in the case of a human corpse? In other words, it is a logical derivation, a kol v'chomer, if small earthenware vials, which are tarhu in the case of a zav, become tama in the case of contact with a human corpse, then is it not logically compelling that the mat which becomes tama in the case of a zav becomes tama in the case of a contact with a human corpse? And this Tana derives the susceptibility of a mat to corpse tumah, both in regard to tumah until evening and in regard to tumah for 7 days. Would you like me, guys, to unpack it for you easily?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Unpack it easily,
Okay.
please.
All right. So first thing we learn here is a very, very interesting rule. I want you, Kev, to go to Bat Midbar, chapter 31, verse 20.
And every garment and every vessel of leather and everything made from you shall purify.
Okay, so let me just unpack the context of this. Kevin is right that different articles contract tumor in different ways. Some are more susceptible than others, just like with heat. If you've got metal, it conducts heat far better than earthenware, but earthenware retains heat far better. So metal heats up quick and cools down quick. Earthenware heats up slow, but retains the heat for a long period of time. That's why you have poiki cost. So there's different articles that some are more susceptible to tumor than others. Things that are generally not as porous, like a rock, are less susceptible to tumor than something that is porous and absorbs. Okay, so Kev, it's a good point. So in Bamidbar, chapter 31, verse 20, what it's talking about here is that the Israelite army returned from their war. They fought against Midian. They were successful. And when they killed the Midianites, they had a lot of corpse tumor that they contracted. And they had to obviously purify a lot of objects from that tumor. As far as I know, I don't think it's talking about their own particular objects. The reason I'm saying this is if they were at war, they wouldn't come home and infect their own objects. I think what happened is to the spoils goes to the victor goes the spoils. Do you know what that means? It means
Person who wins, get everything.
The winner takes all.
Winner takes all,
There we go.
as the Abba song says. The winner takes all.
Damon, I just want to ask you something. Sorry, 1 second. I thought non-Jews corpses don't carry tumor. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Excellent. This is what I was coming to say.
I was going to think that Ashkar.
As a Kohen, that's a very, very interesting question. And that's always, in a way, been my objection. I had this argument with Rav Simcha, where he conceded. And I said to him, it doesn't give a great, I said, it gives a bit of a confusing message. On the one hand, it says there's corpse tumor. All right, so bottom line, the Israelites were victorious from their campaign against Midian. And then after they killed many of the Midianites, they were ordered to purify both themselves as well as certain articles. So every garment, I don't know if it was garments that they wore that took from the Midianites. No, garment, clothing.
Oh, they took the kalim as well. Okay.
No, we're getting there.
Okay.
So the first thing it mentions is garment, because clothing is very susceptible to tumor in terms of absorption.
Yes.
Okay, it's one of the most susceptible. Every leather utensil. What do we mean by a leather utensil? The Gemara uses the utensil term loosely. Utensil comes from the word utilize, to make use of. When we use the word utensil, I think of a spatula in the kitchen. Does that make sense? Or nail clippers, where you cut my nails and then there's shrapnel and you've got to move the other way. So those are utensils. But the general term of utensils is utilization thereof, meaning anything
Okay.
that you can use that's made of a particular product. So we learned every garment, which is fabric, every leather utensil, everything made of goat materials, and every wooden utensil. So whether it was leather, wood, goat materials, or clothing. Okay.
And ceramics
then,
and pot, that type of thing.
Okay, excellent. So in Numbers, by chapter 19, verse 15, for some reason it mentions that elsewhere. Sorry, Kev, we don't have time to go through it, but it mentions there earthenware vessels contract tumor from a human corpse.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does it mention? Basically, wooden leather utensils. When it says wooden leather, it often refers to containers. Why do we mean that? Is because there they used wood for, you'd make a trunk like when you went to camp, you'd make suitcases. And leather, because you have pouches, you see these Westerns where there's water in the leather. They make a leather poncho where there's water in and stuff like that. So all these things contain tumah, but there's something not mentioned specifically, and that's a mat. So what's the question mark before we bring this kol v'chomer? Since a mat is not included in the category of a container, because when they use the term a container, what does a container mean? To contain, to hold. So a leather container would hold within it, like if I give you a briefcase made of leather, it contains documents and pens and pencils and calculators, or a container would hold food or drink or articles. A mat is flat and therefore is not defined as a container, but as a flat utensil. Poshite kli 8. It's a flat utensil, and that's in Kalim chapter 2, verse 1, and chapter 15, verse 1. So this is the big question. How do we know that it contracts tumah if under the same roof or contact with a human corpse? In other words, what's the question mark? Whenever we have a kol v'chomer and a dayu, there's always a question mark. What's the question mark here?
No,
What happens to the mat? Yeah, a mat is not mentioned. Why is it not mentioned? Because a mat is not necessarily a container or a utensil. It's flat. It's bedding material.
Okay.
So we need to find out the status. That's the question mark. Fine. Now that we need to find out that particular status, there's two ways a human corpse can infect something. What are the two ways, guys?
Touching or carrying.
Not quite.
Into contact, coming in close proximity.
Okay, so touching is one, and close proximity is another. So the human corpse can either touch an article that would make it impure, and then you've got what you call air contamination.
Okay.
Which means within where the ole is, where the body is, within that room where that body has to be guarded, that contaminates open containers through the air. So, for example, even when one is sleeping, you shouldn't have an open glass of water or open containers for contractual contamination. It gives there two different reasons. The one is perhaps poisonous snakes, and the other one is that there's a certain level of tumor that goes to a body when it's sleeping. But the bottom line is that a corpse also has air tumor.
Okay.
In a certain parameter. It's obviously a certain amount of amos that are specified. I don't know what they are. Okay. So a zav is different. A zav transmits tumor either through touching a susceptible item or moving it, or through sitting or leaning and lying on an object, okay? Or in an article reserved for such uses, right? So if I want to teach you the law of moving, in order to move an article, what do I have to do in order to move it first?
To move an article.
Guys, I've got to touch the article. If I want to move it from point A to B, I've got to
Grab
touch.
it.
Yes. So we have to learn the laws of touching before moving. Moving is from A to B, but you need to touch it in order to do so. So, Zav, it has to either touch it, or what we see is liquids that emit from a Zav, semen, spittle, etc., through touching and carrying. But with the Zav itself, it's through touching. It doesn't seem that it's through carrying exactly. Does that make sense, guys? It says the Zav fluid of a Zav, his spittle, his semen, his urine. So that means fluids relating to him affect things by touching and carrying because they land on objects. So therefore, if you're touching it, but if a Zav touches you, that would have to be direct. It would seem. Fine. So what's this kol v'chomer and how does it work? Is that an earthenware vessel can't contract tumor via its outside, but only via its inside airspace. So, in other words, if I have a properly sealed earthenware vessel, it doesn't even contract tumor under the same roof as a human corpse.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, go to Bad Midbar, chapter 19, verse 15, Kevin.
Okay.
We've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I know. Oh, there we go. Okay. Any vessel that is open, that has no cover fastened onto it, contaminated it is. Anyone who touches on the surface of the field, one slain by the sword, or one that died, or a bone of a human or a grave, shall be contaminated for 7 days.
Okay.
They shall
They shall?
they shall take for the contaminated person some of the ashes of the burning.
Okay, so it's
up to there, yeah.
This is the bottom line. If it's sealed, the earthenware container, it can't contract air tumor.
Okay.
And even if a dead body touches the outside, it's not going to affect the contents as long as you purify the outside. So it would have to be sealed. Now, the minute it's unsealed, even if a corpse doesn't touch it directly, but it's under the same tent as a dead body, then what it's contracted by air tumor within a certain parameter. So if a container is open, it contracts tumor. Does that make sense, guys? Yeah. But with the Zav, it doesn't contract tumor. Why? Because the vial is too small for a Zav to stick his fingers in there. So unless the Zav spat in there or discharged semen in there for whatever reason, there's no possible way it could affect it. He would have to physically put his finger in, and we say the vial, you know the blood vial when they take bloods, it's very small container, or the opening is very small. So that wouldn't contract tumor from a Zav. We're not interested in the outside, we're interested in the inside. So a corpse would contract an open container with air tumor, but a Zav would not because he can't stick his fingers into them.